Arctic, like penguin. It's good penguin footing.
Uh-huh.
I'm out throwing sand around so I don't kill anybody if they show up.
Indeed.
Every,
Okay, I'm going to open
I'm glad we
YouTube
waited.
in a second.
All right. You're on it already.
Yeah.
We're live
I'm,
already. No swearing, guys.
All right.
let's see now. Hello, everyone. Okay. Oops. Oh, well, it doesn't matter. I'm not going to show any video. Welcome. It is Dis and Dat, and today I have two things I wanted to do. Um, I came across an article on subsumption, which is as part of this larger project I'm working on, which unfortunately every time I read something on it, I have to go read something else. So getting my life is getting stupider. But I thank you for showing up. Today is Dis and Dat to February 17th. And I'm going to finish off talking about this is the first chapter of Ian Wright's PhD dissertation called The Law of Value, a Contribution to the Classical Approach to Economic Analysis. It's one of those dissertations that, you don't have to put Marx in the title, but, those in the know will know that this is about Marx. But it's very career-wise, I think that's always a smart idea not to put Marx in the title. Anyway. Um, so I'll begin where I left off on Saturday and to finish off Ian Wright's dissertation. And then I'll begin, because I think I'll get to the end early, and I will spool ahead to a portion of a different article by called Subsumption by Andres Saints de Cecilia. And an interesting article because it takes up the concept that I've been fiddling around with, and that is how is it that uh, is one way, one approach. I think subsumption is the answer or an answer to solving the problem that the uh, theories of value present to us. That is, how is it that we can make comments about value without necessarily attaching labor? Now, there may be labor in it. And in fact, this supports the notion that Marx was talking not about labor itself, although he accepted the notion of labor, a labor theory of value from Ricardo, but rather when he moved to labor power, it was pretty clear that he's moving to something else, something very Hegelian, and something that needs further articulation and is not adequately covered, I would suppose, in Marxist thought, but is only one portion of the many different things I've been fiddling around with, as you perhaps know, and that I'll finally have something to write about at some other moment. But it's sorting this sort of thing out because it's an area that, originally I thought it was going to be a kind of not so much post-Marxism nor post-structural or whatever. And in fact, it led me back, with all due respect, to Frankfurt School critical theory, because there are a body of folks who still follow that stuff, and the idea of subsumption actually sort of fits in certain approaches, even though that's not maybe the front end of it. And there's a small literature on subsumption. It is an important feature, and not that it's understudied, but um, I would say it's one of many, a couple of at least, methodological tools that allow us to get at the question of not only labor power, abstract labor, or a theory of value that doesn't kind of get us into the usual problems of value form, or and one can actually argue that it is an extension of the value form arguments. So on the one hand, it doesn't contradict any particular emphasis on value form theory. Um, Rather, I think it actually contributes to explaining it better. And in fact, and that's kind of my little point, is to bridge it from a what it appears to be and isn't, but appears to be a qualitative analysis, and to allow us to move towards something that's perhaps a little more quantitative and perhaps has empirical significance. So, but that's going way ahead of our little project here. So, to get back to, I read from page 4 to about 20 something on Saturday, and let's see if we can get a little further along. Let me start at 1.4.2, Marx's irrational commodity, because I think that's probably the best place to start. Marx's theory of value remains, even to this day, the most ambitious and sophisticated attempt to establish a semantic relationship between the monetary unit of account and the material activity of human labor. Partisans of Marx's thought are naturally concerned to defend this scientific legacy. Unfortunately, many criticisms of Marx's theory of value are decidedly superficial, and it quickly becomes wearisome to encounter another screed on Marx's supposed errors. In consequence, the typical partisan is conditioned to view any criticism of Marx's theory with a jaundiced eye. My chapter 3, that is Ian Wright's chapter 3, which introduces a new and critical reading of the hard core of Marx's economic theory, is therefore likely to be regarded at best warily. In way of an apology and invite, I offer the following quotation from Hegel's Science of Logic. Intelligent reflection, to mention this here, consists, on the contrary, in grasping and asserting contradiction. Even though it does not express the notion of things and their relationships, and has for its material and content only the determinations of ordinary thinking, it does bring these into a relation that contains their contradiction and allows their notion to show or shine through the contradiction. Thinking reason, however, sharpens, so to say, the blunt difference of diverse terms, the mere manifoldness of pictorial thinking, into essential difference, into opposition. Only when the manifold terms have been driven to the point of contradiction do they become active and lively towards one another, receiving in contradiction the negativity, which is the indwelling pulsation of self-movement and spontaneous activity. Oh, those Germans. The language may initially seem opaque, yeah, but Hegel's methodological remarks here are highly sophisticated. Partisans of dialectical materialism should pay even closer attention to logical contradictions at the level of ordinary thinking for the reason Hegel gives. Often, to make theoretical progress, we need to compress the manifold terms of a complex theory into an essential logical contradiction. The reduction to a logical contradiction may reveal a glimpse of an underlying process of change that the theory fails to adequately reflect. I argue in chapter 3, that is, Wright argues that the classical error identified in chapter 2 is the essential contradiction of the hard core of Marx's economic theory. Marx's theory is indissolubly bound to his Hegelian commitments, and therefore the classical error takes a specific form in his work. This chapter, therefore, chapter 3, tackles philosophical themes normally absent from strictly economic interpretations of Marx's Capital. Chapter 3 may also be a good starting point for readers familiar with Marx's work, but less familiar with linear algebra, since I explain the key distinction between classical and total labor costs without recourse to linear production theory. That's kind of the default for a lot of Marxian analysis. The chapter begins by examining the surface features of Marx's relatively neglected theory of money capital, money-capital. This serves as an entry point for deeper issues. The prices of ordinary commodities in Marx's theory of value are lawfully regulated by their labor costs. Money capital, in contrast, is an irrational commodity with the form of a commodity, but not its substance, because its price, which is the interest rate quoted in capital markets, lacks a lawful relation relationship to labor costs? Yes, it does. Money capital, in consequence, is an exceptional or unique commodity, or as Marx states, a commodity sui generis. Marx's description of money capital as irrational summarizes the opposing implications of his theory of economic value and his theory of surplus value. Marx's theory of value suggests that money capital is a bona fide commodity with a corresponding real cost, which is the labor supplied to bring it to market, whereas his theory of surplus value suggests that money capital is sui generis because the labor supplied to bring it to market is surplus labor, which is an excess of labor over and above that necessary to reproduce workers applied or supplied gratis to capitalists. Surplus labor is an intrinsically costless net output, or something for nothing, which cannot constitute a real cost of production. Money capital, therefore, belongs to the class of commodities that have a price without having a labor value. For example, land is that, or conscious honor, other things. Marx, as a follower of Hegel, is committed to an ontology that admits dialectical contradictions. Marx can therefore accept that irrational kinds exist in reality. A logical contradiction denotes an impossibility, i.e., a square circle. In contrast, a real or dialectical contradiction denotes the struggle of parts of the system to control a property of the system in incompatible ways. For example, two teams in a game of tug of war that attempt to pull the rope in opposite directions. Real contradictions are the cause of change and motion. Hence, a system with real contradictions is logically possible, but may ultimately be unstable and therefore transient on some time scale. Now, Marx applies the Hegelian ontology to the sweep of human history. Marx's materialist conception of history aspires to explain the rise and fall of kinds of societies in terms of recurring real contradictions between the causal powers of human labor and the social institutions that organize those powers. Humans spontaneously learn from their material practice and embody their knowledge in the form of tools and machinery. In consequence, their causal powers have a tendency to alter and improve. At certain historical junctures, the social institutions become a fetter that prevent the full realization of those powers. The social institutions have become irrational and ripe for abolition. From the counterfactual perspective of causal possibilities immanent within society. As Friedrich Engels, Marx's lifelong collaborator, states, all that is real in the sphere of human history becomes irrational in the process of time, is therefore irrational by its very destination, is tainted beforehand with irrationality. In consequence, all that exists deserves to perish, which is pretty nihilistic when you get down to it. Anyway, capitalism as a contradictory social formation necessarily throws up irrational kinds, such as money capital, money-capital. According to Marx, the relations of capital assume their most externalized and most fetish-like forms in money capital. Marx is therefore comfortable with money capital constituting an exception to his theory of value. The main proposition of Chapter 3 is that Marx's arguments for this conclusion commit a logical fallacy. In consequence, Marx mischaracterizes the nature of money capital and unnecessarily restricts the explanatory reach of the labor theory of value. My argument relies on a distinction between factual and counterfactual accounts of the labor process. Marx's theory of surplus value as an application of historical materialism is an irreducibly counterfactual theory that identifies economic possibilities that capitalist institutions prevent. I demonstrate that Marx implicitly builds his theory of surplus value upon a comparison between an empirical state of affairs, specifically the labor process organized under the rubric of capitalist property relations, and a possible state of affairs, especially the labor process organized under the rubric of post-capitalist property relations. Marx justifies his classification of surplus labor as excess labor supplied to capitalists for free by noting that this labor would be unnecessary in a post-capitalist society. Workers in such circumstances would not need to supply surplus labor in order to receive the real wages and reproduce themselves. In this precise counterfactual sense, surplus labor is not a necessary cost of production. I emphasize, therefore, that Marx's theory of surplus value is a critical theory of capitalist production that rejects the cost structure engendered by capitalist property relations. But what if we take a purely factual view of the labor process? Capitalists, of course, do not supply money capital for free, either nominally or in real terms. Workers, when organized under the rubric of capitalist property relations, in fact supply surplus labor in order to receive the real wage and reproduce themselves. In this precise factual sense, therefore, surplus labor is a necessary cost of production. So is the surplus labor supplied to capitalists a cost of production or not? On the one hand, and following Marx, we may take a critical view of the capitalist labor process and observe that the supply of surplus labor is historically contingent and therefore counterfactually unnecessary. On the other hand, we may take an empirical view of the labor process, which Marx does not do, and observe that surplus labor, although historically contingent, is factually necessary in the empirical circumstances of a capitalist economy. Now, which view should we adopt? We should adopt the viewpoint commensurate with our theoretical aims, such as whether we wish to critique or explain the cost structure engendered by capitalist property relations. Classical labor cost accounting, by excluding surplus labor as a cost, yields a counterfactual measure of, quote unquote, difficulty of production, and therefore provides the quantitative basis for a critique of the cost logic of capitalism. Total labor cost accounting, introduced in Chapter 2, includes surplus labor as a cost and therefore yields a factual measure of difficulty of production that provides the quantitative basis for an explanation of the cost logic of capitalism. The general labor theory of value sketched in Chapter 2 includes both kinds of labor costs and applies them in the appropriate context. Marx's labor theory of value, in contrast, admits only the classical measure. Marx's theory of value, when compared to his theory of surplus value, has the distinct explanatory aim of establishing a semantic relation between money and labor time. Marx's transformation, for example, proposes that natural prices are conservative transforms of the underlying labor costs. Marx, unfortunately, attempts to explain a factual cost structure that includes surplus value as a cost, that is, as natural prices, in terms of a counterfactual cost structure that excludes surplus labor as a cost, that is, classical labor costs. But a factual cost structure cannot be explained in terms of a counterfactual cost structure. This is the fundamental logical contradiction in the hard core of Marx's economic theory. Marx aims to construct a unified theory of value and exploitation. On the one hand, Marx employs his theory of surplus value to reject the cost logic of capitalism. On the other hand, Marx employs his theory of value to explain that logic. Now, explaining that logic is not necessarily a rejection, so that's another story. A counterfactual measure of labor costs can satisfy only one of these aims. The classical error in Marx's work takes the form of a conflation of empirical and critical analyses. The fundamental contradiction manifests as different surface problems. The most well-known manifestation is the transformation problem discussed in Chapter 2. Marx's theory of the irrational nature of money capital discussed in Chapter 3 is another, less well-known manifestation. The classical error, once again, splits nominal phenomena, in this case the interest rate, from real phenomena, in this case the labor supplied to bring money capital to market. Hence, Marx classifies money capital as irrational with a price that lacks labor content. A general labor theory of value provides a different perspective. Money capital, in the general theory, is a fully fledged commodity with a natural price proportional to total labor cost. Total labor cost accounting reveals the intimate relation between nominal and real cost structures induced by capitalist property relations. However, Marx's critical analysis of capitalist production identifies the surplus labor supplied by workers as unnecessary Classical labor cost accounting, which measures the quantity of surplus labor supplied and the degree of exploitation, etc., reveals the exploitative relation between workers and capitalists. The general theory can therefore claim that money capital is a rational commodity with a price that has labor content, while simultaneously claim that money capital is the product of social relations that are irrational from the perspective of historical materialism. The general theory relocates the irrationality of money capital from its nature as a commodity to its nature as a social practice. In other words, we can simultaneously critique money capital and include it within the explanatory reach of the labor theory of value. Hegel advised that only when the manifold terms have been driven to the point of contradiction do they become active and lively towards one another, receiving in contradiction the negativity which is the indwelling pulsation of self-movement and spontaneous activity. The self-movement and spontaneous activity or process of change revealed by the fundamental contradiction is the historically contested and changing definition of what should and should not constitute a necessary cost of production in human society. Marx employs a single definition of necessary cost, a theory with sufficient representational capacity to adequately reflect this historical process includes contested and therefore multiple definitions. This is what a more general labor theory of value provides. 1.4.3, Sraffa's incomplete reductions to labor. Piero Sraffa's work in the 20th century significantly contributed to a revival of the classical approach to value and distribution. Chapter 4 examines Sraffa's answer to the value question. Sraffa is acutely aware of the problems of the classical labor theory of value. Sraffa demonstrates in his major work, Productions of Commodities by Means of Commodities, 1960, that natural prices necessarily vary independently of classical labor costs. Sraffa's reduction to dated quantities of labor represents natural prices as a sum of a series of terms when we trace back the successive stages of the production of the commodity. The costs of production at each stage consists of the wages of labor and the interest on the money capital advance compounded over the duration of the advance. Natural prices are therefore reducible to a sum of wage and interest income. Sraffa's reduction equation makes it particularly clear that natural prices can change due to an alteration in the wage or interest rate, even though the labor supplied to produce commodities remains constant. Sraffa therefore rejects the idea that real costs, such as labor time, function as a measure of value. In consequence, post-Sraffian scholarship is near unanimous in rejecting this aspect of classical theory, especially Marx's more emphatic assertions of the necessary links between prices and labor time. In Chapter 4, I demonstrate that Sraffa's reduction equation is incomplete in the specific sense that some actual labor supplied during the successive stages of the production of the commodity is missing. The key issue, as should be clear by now, is that classical labor costs, which Sraffa employs, do not include surplus labor as a cost of production. In consequence, the surplus labor supplied at each stage of production is missing from Sraffa's reduction equation. In contrast, I construct the complete reduction to dated quantities of labor equation that includes the surplus labor supplied at each stage of production. Natural prices in this alternative but quantitatively equivalent representation completely reduced to a sum of wage incomes only. The complete reduction equation makes it particularly clear that natural prices are always proportional to total labor costs, regardless of the distribution of income. Sraffa's rejection of the possibility of a labor theory of value is therefore based on an incomplete reduction to dated quantities of labor. In this sense, Sraffa reproduces, or at least does not identify, the classical error. Nonetheless, Sraffa constructs a subtle and refined objective theory of value, which reconstructs some aspects of classical theory. In particular, Sraffa proposes a partial solution to Ricardo's problem of an invariable measure of value. Sraffa observes that natural prices are relative rather than absolute, since they are underdetermined up to an arbitrary choice of numeraire. For example, assume that the natural prices of a two-commodity economy are P1 equals 1 and P2 equals 4. If we choose the numeraire P1 equals 1 or P1 equals 1/4 and P2 equals 1, if we choose the numeraire P2 equals 1. In both cases, the relative cost structure is identical. The choice of numeraire then fixes an absolute, although arbitrary, scale. Sraffa notes the following problem. Consider a change in the distribution of income, i.e. a change in the wage or profit rate that alters the structure of natural prices. For example, assume that prices change from P1 equals 1 and P2 equals 2, given our choice of numeraire, P1 equals 1. Can we therefore assert that P2 have, due to the change in the distribution of income? No, because the change in the distribution of income alters the entire structure of relative prices, including the relative price of the numeraire commodity. For example, if we instead had chosen the numeraire P2 equals 1, then we might be tempted to assert that P2 remained constant while P1 doubled. Sraffa notes, it is impossible to tell of any particular price fluctuation whether it arises from the peculiarities of the commodity which is being measured or from those of the measuring standard. Sraffa's problem is precisely Ricardo's problem of finding an invariable measure of value, except restricted to the special case of changes in the duration of income. It's not always sufficiently appreciated that Sraffa's problem only arises because the classical labor theory fails to explain the structure of natural prices. If that theory succeeded, then natural prices would reduce to labor costs, and therefore labor costs would function as price-independent absolute measures of value. The failure of the classical theory does not prompt Sraffa to adopt Samuel Bailey's nihilist position that natural prices are merely exchange ratios, i.e. relative quantities that do not denote, refer to, or measure some non-price substance. Instead, Sraffa, via a remarkable and often misunderstood argument, constructs an invariable measure that partially solves Ricardo's problem. The invariable measure is Sraffa's celebrated standard commodity, which is a special collection of commodities with the peculiar property that its price is independent of the fluctuation in prices that accompany a change in the distribution of income. Chapter 4 explains, in formal terms, how Sraffa's standard economy functions as an Archimedean standpoint outside the system of relative prices from which to measure the objective value of commodities. Now, once we adopt the standard commodity as numeraire, then we can be sure that any price fluctuations do not arise from the peculiarities of the measuring standard. After this breakthrough, Sraffa then delivers something like a punchline to an elaborate theoretical joke. Sraffa reduces his standard commodity to the variable quantity of labor that can be purchased by it. The quantity is variable because the price of the standard commodity, although independent of prices, nonetheless varies with the distribution of income. Sraffa explains how we can adopt this variable quality of labor as the numeraire without needing to specify the composition of the standard commodity. The standard commodity, therefore, is a purely auxiliary construction, a mere step in the argument towards the conclusion that a scalar quantity of labor, rather than a heterogeneous collection of commodities, is an invariable measure of value. Now, Sraffa's argument reconstructs in attenuated form aspects of the classical theory of value, especially the attempt to measure a given physical surplus in terms of labor costs and relate how that quantity of labor breaks down into wage and profit income. However, as Sraffa notes, this invariable measure is not a real cost of production, but equivalent to something very close to the standard suggested by Adam Smith, namely labor commanded, quote unquote. A general labor theory of value, which admits both classical and total labor costs, provides an entirely different perspective of Sraffa's problematic and clarifies the meaning of Sraffa's argument. I prove in Chapter 4 that Sraffa's variable quantity of labor is the total labor cost of the standard commodity. Sraffa's invariable measure of value is therefore a proxy or indirect reference to the total labor costs introduced in Chapter 2. In consequence, Sraffa's invariable standard is not merely labor commanded, but also a labor embodied measure of value that denotes a real cost of construction. Sraffa implicitly and without knowing refers to total labor costs, which is the external standard of natural prices missing from the classical theory. Now, Sraffa's remarks that some properties of his argument are, quote unquote, curious, especially, quote, that we should be enabled to use a standard without knowing what it consists of, unquote. The mystery lessens once we realize that Sraffa's argument is highly indirect. The standard commodity is a bridge from the premise that labor costs cannot measure natural prices to the conclusion that a quantity of labor is nonetheless an invariable measure. The bridge can be thrown away, as Sraffa's analysis demonstrates, because the premise is mistaken. Sraffa's argument is a rather large hint that an invariable measure of value exists, which is not a composite, but rather a single substance. Sraffa's remarkable construction of the standard commodity therefore partially identifies the total labor costs that natural prices denote. In consequence, Sraffa's original problem of choosing an invariable numeraire disappears, since we immediately possess a real cost standard outside the market and its system of relative prices. I conclude that Sraffa's reconstruction of classical economics is incomplete because it fails to reconstruct a measurement relation between natural prices and real costs of production. The perspective of a more general theory of value is required for the complete reconstruction. Section 1.4.4, Passanetti's vertically integrated subsystems and Marx's transformation problem. Most interpreters of Sraffa believe his analysis implies that the labor theory of value is at best incomplete, or worse, logically incoherent. And this reference here is to Samuelson and Steedman and Lippi, divided by a decade, since they take it as conclusively demonstrating that natural prices and labor costs are fundamentally incommensurate. Luigi Passanetti, a pupil of Sraffa, offers a different interpretation. He proposes a separation thesis that orders the study of economic systems into a pre-institutional or quote unquote natural stage of investigation concerned with the quote foundational bases of economic relations, followed by an institutional stage, which is carried out at the level of the actual economic institutions. Passanetti's attitude to the labor theory of value is shaped by this separation. Passanetti argues in a series of works that the labor theory of value is a powerful analytic tool at the pre-institutional stage of investigation and therefore provides a logical frame of reference with an extraordinarily high number of remarkable analytical and normative properties. For example, Passanetti analyzes the pre-institutional cost structure of a non-uniformly growing economy. He generalizes the labor theory by proving that this economy's natural prices are proportional to a more general measure of labor costs, which he calls the hyper-integrated labor coefficients that include the labor supply to produce net investment goods. At the institutional stage of analysis, however, this even more general labor theory breaks down. Passanetti proposes a complete generalization of Marx's transformation problem by proving that the natural prices engendered by capitalist property relations in the context of his non-uniformly growing economy are not proportional to the hyper-integrated labor coefficients. Passanetti concludes that a theory of value in terms of pure labor can never reflect the price structure that emerges from the operation of the market in a capitalist economy. Passanetti therefore restricts the labor theory of value to a normative role that provides a, quote, natural or ideal standard from which to analyze the institutional setups of actual economic system. Passanetti's attitude echoes Adam Smith's restriction of the labor theory to an early and rude state of society that precedes the accumulation of stock. Chapter 5 critically examines Passanetti's argument. I note that Passanetti's proposal of generalizing the concept of labor cost to apply to more general economic situations is an important conceptual advance over the classical theory. However, I argue that Passanetti's restriction of the labor theory to a purely normative role is unwarranted. Passanetti's generalization of Marx's transformation problem reproduces the classical error at a higher level of generality. Passanetti's hyper-integrated coefficients are pre-institutional labor costs that ignore additional real costs engendered by capitalist property relations. Passanetti necessarily encounters a transformation problem when he contravenes his own separation thesis and compares a nominal cost structure, which belongs to the institutional stage of analysis, with a real cost structure that belongs to a natural or pre-institutional stage of analysis. The general theory introduced in Chapter 2 dissolves Passanetti's transformation problem. I construct the total labor costs for Passanetti's economy, which generalize the hyper-integrated coefficients to include the real costs induced by the institutional conditions of production. I prove that the natural prices of Passanetti's non-uniformly growing economy are proportional to its total labor costs. This result demonstrates that the concept of total labor cost applies to quite general economic situations. A suitably generalized labor theory of value, which includes both natural and institutional measures of labor cost and employs them in their appropriate context, is therefore neither incomplete or incoherent, not restricted to a normative role, but spans both the natural and institutional stages of analysis. The post-Strophian surplus approach to classical theory discards problematic elements of the classical theory of value, specifically the attempt to explain natural prices in terms of real costs measured in labor time. In contrast, Marxian authors normally defend this aspect of classical theory either by counter-critique or creative reinterpretation of Marxist theory. The theory of value is the fundamental issue that separates the Marxian and Strophian schools. In my view, the Strophian tradition has properly internalized the real problems of the classical theory of value, but incorrectly rejected its essential elements, whereas the Marxian tradition has in general failed to fully internalize its real problems, but has correctly retained its essential elements. Both sides of the debate share a conceptual framework that reproduces the classical error of expecting a commensurate relationship to obtain between cost structures defined by incommensurate accounting conventions. Chapters 2 to 5 of this thesis contribute to dissolving this separation by revealing the possibility of a theoretical unification centered on the development of a more general labor theory of value. The general theory developed in this thesis both explains and resolves the recurring split of nominal from real phenomena that repeatedly manifests in the classical economic tradition. From Smith's restriction of the labor theory to pre-civilized times, Ricardo's struggles to find an invariable measure of value, Marx's attempt to build a unified theory of value and exploitation, Stropha's incomplete reconstruction of the classical theory, and Passanetti's restriction of the labor theory to a normative one. All these theoretical problems or limitations can be better understood and also resolved in a relatively straightforward manner once we adopt the more general viewpoint. 1.4.5, Substance or Field, a note on Mirovsky. Chapter 6 serves as an interlude that introduces some necessary conceptual clarity prior to introducing a dynamic model in Chapter 7. The meaning of a labor cost, especially as employed by Marx, is subtle and not always well understood, even when we simplify and drop Marx's modifier, socially necessary, by assuming that firms in each sector of production have homogeneous labor productivity, as assumed in this thesis. And what does Marx mean, for example, by the phrase embodied or congealed labor? Philip Mirovsky criticizes Marx for holding two contradictory theories of value: a substance theory, where a commodity's labor cost is the historical cost embodied at the time of production, and a field theory, where a commodity's labor cost is its current cost of replacement given the prevailing technical conditions of production. Mirovsky claims that Marx constructs a contradictory theory of value that uses both incompatible principles and therefore must choose between a substance or field theory of value. Chapter 6 is a short note that clarifies Marx's concept of labor cost by criticizing Mirovsky's thesis. I argue that Marx constructs a remarkably sophisticated substance and field theory of value. 1.4.6, the general law of value. The coordination of millions of independent production activities in a large-scale market economy is neither perfect nor equitable, but nonetheless, one should be far more surprised by the existing degree of coordination than by the elements of disorder. The classical tradition developed a theoretical framework in which this surprising fact could be understood. The classical authors, such as Smith and Marx, explained economic coordination as the unintended consequence of the self-interested decisions of economic actors engaged in competition. That is, for example, Smith's invisible hand or Marx's law of value. Capitalists who seek the best returns on their investment withdraw capital from unprofitable sectors and reallocate it to profitable sectors. The scramble for profit eliminates arbitrage opportunities until a general or uniform profit rate prevails across the whole economy, at which point capitalists lack any incentive to reallocate their capital. Capitalist competition, according to the classical authors, is a mechanism that causes market prices of reproducible commodities to gravitate toward or around their natural prices. My formal analysis of the classical theory in chapters 2 to 5 employed a linear production theory to examine steady state or growing economies in natural price equilibrium. These models implicitly assume gravitation is operated to completion. The final chapter of this thesis drops this assumption and applies the formal tools of dynamic systems theory to examine the value question in the more general context of classical macrodynamics. Modern formal analyses of classical gravitation have yielded mixed results that have led some authors to question whether gravitation is possible in principle. Chapter 7 presents a multi-sector, nonlinear, dynamic model of the classical process of gravitation with simultaneous changes in both prices and quantities. I theoretically demonstrate that the equilibrium of the dynamic model is formally equivalent to the steady state discussed in chapters 2 and 4, and I numerically demonstrate via computer simulation that the equilibrium is locally asymptotically stable. The dynamics of capitalist competition causes prices and real costs to grope towards mutual consistency during convergence to equilibrium, at which point natural prices are proportional to total labor costs. I conclude that the classical theory, suitably formalized, constitutes a successful and logically coherent explanation of the homeostatic kernel of capitalist competition. The dynamic model has a Keynesian character because the economy does not operate at full capacity in equilibrium. Capitalist competition in itself does not generate incentives for capitalists to spontaneously coordinate their plans in order to achieve full employment. The dynamic model also has a distinctly classical character, since key economic variables such as the distribution of income, the level of employment, and equilibrium prices are not merely technical outcomes, but crucially depend on how workers and capitalists react to their changing economic circumstances. For example, the key driver of income shares is the management of the interest rate by capitalists in response to fluctuations in their stocks of money wealth. That's kind of like what's going on now. Marx's law of value states that the market prices of reproducible commodities are lawfully regulated by labor costs. The dynamic model makes it particularly clear that the class struggle over the distribution of the surplus is an ineradicable joint cause of the gravitation of market to natural prices. In consequence, market prices are not solely regulated by labor costs. Institutions, in particular, distributional rules instantiated by capitalist property relations, also matter. However, the dynamic model also makes it particularly clear that the homeostatic dynamics of capitalist competition instantiate a lawful regularity between market prices and real costs, measured in labor time. In consequence, natural prices represent labor costs in virtue of a causal law that connects them, much as we might claim that the height of a mercury column represents temperature in virtue of the law of thermal expansion. The dynamic analysis of Chapter 7, therefore, reconstructs Marx's argument presented in Volume 1 of Capital that economic value represents labor time in virtue of the causal regularities of generalized commodity production. My analysis supports Marx's distinctly classical proposition that labor is the substance and the immanent measure of value, i.e., that monetary phenomena in some sense refer to, express, or measure labor time. I conclude the thesis by briefly discussing to what extent the value question has been answered, and I outline some open questions and directions for further research. pretty conventional on that score. Now, I'm just going to read a little bit of subsumption because I know that I've reached the my time limit. Subsumption, Andres Saints de Sicilia. Subsumption counts amongst those concepts of philosophical provenance that are taken up by Marx and recoded as critical social concepts. Originating as a logical category, subsumption nonetheless describes for Marx something fundamental about the basic structure and the developmental tendencies of capitalist societies. Subsumption is, in a sense, the crucial logical figure of capitalist relations, insofar as these relations are founded on the systematically perpetuated subordination of labor to capital. Without this subsumption, there could be no exploitation of surplus value, and so no accumulation and expanded reproduction of capital. The concept of subsumption, however, has a somewhat ambiguous status within Marx's thought. The term appears repeatedly from Marx's early to late writings, yet nowhere is it subject by Marx to a rigorous treatment, and so no explicit theory of subsumption is presented in his writings. What the reader of Marx appears to be confronted with is little more than scattered fragments and indications, allusions to a more substantial position that never appears, or that, in capital, is structurally repressed by the systematizing impulse that governs the movement of Marxist discourse. The ambiguities and apparent ambivalence expressed in Marx's use of the term has been the cause of wide-ranging debates over the uses and misuses of the concept and its relevance for a critical engagement with contemporary reality, spanning assertions of its irrelevance or even theoretical counterproductivity to readings that elevate it as the primary concept characterizing the configuration of contemporary or late capitalism. In this chapter, I consider three aspects of subsumption as a Marxist concept. Number one, its philosophical prehistory, especially in the work of Kant and Hegel, an appreciation of which I argue is crucial to grasping the depth of its significance within Marxist theory. Number two, Marx's conceptualization of subsumption, both at a general level in relation to his materialist methodology and as capitalist subsumption in his critique of political economy. And number three, key interpretations and debates pertaining to subsumption within the Marxist tradition. And I've cut out most of the front end of this and skipped to the place called hybrid subsumption, which I'll probably continue tomorrow because there's enough to do for tomorrow. But it is this question in this section about whether you do or don't include labor process, which is what I was discussing before, what Ian Wright discusses in his chapter 1 of, he's trying to get some labor theory to be consistent, a more generalized labor theory of value. And in this particular kind of discussion of subsumption, there is a discussion of, can surplus value be extorted by capitalists without the labor process being formally subsumed? And so you have a complete negation of that concept on the one hand. On the other hand, you have one affirming or trying to prove the position of the labor theory of value. Now, I would propose to you that I think it's important to generalize more because I think that's kind of where Marx is going anyway, in terms of just simply getting the theory to work so that it would work within the context of his magnum opus, that is Capital Volume 1. But within the context of late 20th century and 21st century thought, it's, I think, actually important. And I think knowledge production, as described by other people, the, knowledge approach to a natural knowledge approach, the NKPE that was being discussed a couple of days ago, that I introduced an idea about for the analysis of 16th and 17th century economies, is still with us. I think you can have a natural knowledge kind of discussion, process discussion, that still is measurable. And while it can, but doesn't have to include labor. And in fact, once you account for the abstraction called labor power, I think you're already on your way to talking about more generalizable solutions. Anyway, that's kind of my little answer to using this. One of the key paragraphs here is instead, either by monopolizing the market for the purchase of the producer's goods or through advances of money, materials, or land needed for production, the capitalist is effectively able to extract a surplus from the producer without purchasing and commanding their labor power. So this is like the kind of opposite of what Ian Wright is talking about. And yet I would assert that because you can get the math to work a little better in the Ian Wright context, that gives you the tools by which you can actually make a counter proposition or negation um, of the idea, particularly in if in fact there is a natural knowledge political economy. Not that I agree that it exists and it's not autonomous. I think it's rather integrated because it needs the what was proposed in what's his face is Winneter or whatever his name is, the guy at Columbia, uh, his position on juridical, necessarily juridical political economy. And I think you need to have both. One cannot work without the other. And in fact, the structure, I would assert, is actually quite similar, and in fact has a family resemblance, and in fact uses the same quantitative tools. And the reason why one was more prevalent than the other was in fact because of the relative rigidity of the juridical form, particularly in the Soviet case. So anyway, that's my little argument there, and I'll stop right here and let's see if there are any questions. Yes, that's a good question. Kelly has a question about labor costs have dropped since Marx's time. Value can still be, well, it's not dependent on labor. I think what we're talking about is a relation to which you can measure various elements relative to labor. And I think that's a different conclusion. As I've said before, I think, when you're doing Marxism or you're doing this body of materialist thought, one of the things that underlies this, if you believe in class struggle, et cetera, the concept of the working class, et cetera, is that you need, as I've said before, the capital is the kind of technical manual for Communist Manifesto. So Communist Manifesto sort of describes we can do this and we can achieve this transformation, and capital provides you with these sort of technical tools to do it. And therefore, the question of dependence or labor dependence is, a more technical question and should not be identified with our, for example, mass organizing, for example. I don't think it should change the nature of mass organizing. In fact, I would assert to you that, the entire digital economy is very poorly organized relative to labor, and that's a whole thing that, and it's incredibly problematic because as we now know, a significant number of people in the digital economy sort of figure in the current crisis. That is, you have Gen Z males now being allowed, to run roughshod over the Treasury or over whatever, the Social Security Administration. You even have idiots trying to crash the San Francisco City Hall to try and steal their data by just putting on hats and claiming they're in Doge. So that's a whole nother story. Let's see. Yes, congealed labor. Yes, we're all congealed labor on Sunday morning, I would assert. Yes, accounting conventions, I can imagine. The anti-flip on the runway sensors. Let's see. Well, the CRJ 900, it's a Canadian jet, so you can blame that on Canada, I suppose. Bombardier, it's in a Bombardier jet, I think. So anyway, that's another story. Anyway, I'm through with yammering here, and so what